Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Goldstein. I'm the curator of public programming here at Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Harold Holzer, who is the director, the Jonathan Fanton director of Roosevelt House, and Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, who unfortunately neither of them could be here tonight, I welcome you on their behalf and on my behalf. So thank you for being here. We are very excited about the program this evening on criminal justice reform. I'll introduce our panelists and our moderator, and they will get the conversation underway. But I know that you have a wonderful evening ahead of you because we had a preview of some of Mark Holden's comments at a meeting he had with students upstairs in the library on the Sarah Delano Roosevelt side of the house. One thing I do want to say is that this issue, surprisingly, criminal justice reform, turns out to have been something that Eleanor Roosevelt cared a great deal about. And last November, when we had Blanche Wiesen Cook here talking about the third volume of her Eleanor Roosevelt biography, it took her a number of years to complete this 3-volume work. And so one of the questions that I asked when I was interviewing her was, looking back now on how you proceeded with the first 2 volumes, is there anything that you look at now differently about Eleanor Roosevelt's life? I mean, it's something that you would write differently, focus on differently from the beginning. And she said that criminal justice reform, given how pressing it is today, is something that she realizes that Eleanor Roosevelt cared passionately about, and she just didn't write enough about it or focus on it enough in her book. So I will introduce the panelists. As I said, Mark Holden, who is the Senior Vice President and General Counsel of Koch Industries. We have Malik Sada Sar, who is the Senior Counsel, Civil and Human Rights at Google. And we have Rick Jones as our moderator. And I want to make this carefully and correct. He is the president-elect of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. His term does not begin until the summer, and apparently he's already looking forward to its ending because it's very impressive to be the past president of this organization. He is also the executive director of the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. So without further ado, we'll have the conversation among the panelists, and then we invite you to a reception in the Four Freedoms room after the discussion so that you can continue to talk with them. Thank you very much.
So I'm gonna try to make sure that I don't overwhelm you with this handheld mic and try to hold it at a safe distance. The hope is that I won't be doing very much of the talking, that you have an opportunity to hear from these folks, which is really the reason why we're here. This is a very special opportunity to sit with both Mark and Malika. And so hopefully I won't have to struggle too much with the microphone because they'll be doing most of the talking. At the outset, really, what I'd like to do is to give both of them an opportunity to tell you why they're here, why this topic of criminal justice reform interests them specifically, and then why their companies support, to the extent that they do, them being here, and then we'll take it from there. But I want, as a sort of a foundation, I want you to give us a sense of why you're here and why your companies are interested in criminal justice reform. Maybe we'll start with you, Malika.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. I'm a human rights lawyer. I did not become a human rights lawyer to work for Google. I spent over 15 years as a human rights lawyer really focused on issues of gender-based violence, racial justice, and certainly the intersection between. I was very focused at the 2 different organizations I led in looking at the particular situation that women and girls find themselves when it comes to incarceration and mass incarceration. And so I worked very hard at really zeroing in on how women have been left behind in the conversation around conditions of confinement and criminalization. We fought to end the shackling of mothers behind bars during labor and childbirth in our federal correctional facilities. And we worked very hard to look at the particular ways in which our girls who are bought and sold for sex are criminalized as child prostitutes, as opposed to the victims and survivors of trafficking that they are. I came to Google last January, was brought on board to really think through what is the role that Google can play in advancing civil and human rights. And the particular issue of criminal justice was one that I really wanted our company to engage in more, because unlike 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, it is powerfully a bipartisan issue. It is an issue that allows our company to bring different parts of our communities together. And also because Google is about disruption, right? That's what we do, we disrupt. But we disrupt for good. And if anything needs to be disrupted, it is certainly the criminal justice system. I think the other reason why this is an issue for our company, and especially right now, is because there are also opportunities to use tech around mass incarceration. And Mark and I often talk about the issue of how when we put people behind bars, there's no connection that is necessarily allowed, right? We can't scale the prison walls. But with tech, there is that opportunity to think through, how do we scale the prison walls? As Brian Stevenson talks about, when we are proximate to those who are incarcerated, we have a different perspective on their suffering. We are connected to them in a powerful way. So tech can be an opportunity for us to be proximate. And part of what I'm working with at Google is using technologies like virtual reality to be able to scale the prison wall and create proximity. So we did something called 6x9, which was a full VR immersion in the experience of solitary. You absolutely, in sight and sound, feel as if you are in a 6x9 cell. And narrating that experience, that full immersion, are the words of individuals who have been subject to solitary. We're really interested in thinking through more how to use that kind of technology to create that experience of bearing witness to those who have been subject to human rights abuses because of incarceration, to those who have endured certain costs around incarceration.
Well, that's a tough act to follow. So great to be here tonight. And my personal story on the criminal justice system goes back to where I'm from, which is Worcester, Massachusetts. And before I went to law school, the best job I had was as a prison guard when I was in last year of high school and then the first 2 years of college. And it opened my eyes to a lot of things that I had never thought about or seen before. It was the start of the war on drugs in the 1980s. And when I worked in the prison, there were a number of kids that I grew up with from the same neighborhood, went to the same schools, same church, you name it, who were inmates in the prison. And I come from a working class background, and this easily could have been me. It was one of those there before the grace of God, go I moments. And what I saw there was between the friends, the kids I grew up with who were in prison, and then a lot of other people who were in prison. And I was a young kid, and it didn't make sense because my sense was you go to prison when you hurt someone, you're violent, or you're a robber or something like that. And these were drug addicts who were really poor, who had no support, and ended up in the system. So that never sat well with me. And I was lucky that the things I did that they did, they got caught for. I didn't get caught for, I guess is the best way to put it, because it could have easily been me, and I probably wouldn't be here today. After that, I had another job in a plastics factory outside of Worcester. And I was a janitor. I was a really good janitor. Not like Goodwill Hunting doing math or anything, just cleaning stuff up, but I was still really good. But every day, the work crew was augmented with about 8 to 10 people from the local county lockup. And it was kind of my friend's father was a foreman there, and he kind of got me the job, and it was a primitive or early reentry program. And they were great guys, most of them. As I said earlier when I was talking to some of the students who were very impressive, very passionate about these issues, and that gives us all hope. There are about 10 people, 8 of them were really good guys that were in work release, and 2 weren't, which is usually the regular distribution in society of who's nice and who isn't. And to Malika's point, I was proximate at a young age to what goes on in prison, who gets caught up in prison mostly, and it's the poorest of the poor and the least educated of the least educated. And that was the start of the drug wars when we decided to treat a public health crisis like drug addiction and poverty issues and mental health issues like criminal issues. And that was a bipartisan decision, and in my opinion, it's best intentions, but a blight on our society and our free society for sure. And so now we have a chance to correct that, and that's very exciting. I also came to this issue by working at Coke. From the time I worked at Coke, which is 22 years now, I've been an employment lawyer, now I'm general counsel. We always, we had the box on our application for a while, then we got rid of it. We hired people with criminal records regularly, and that was because of Charles Koch and David Koch. David Koch is one of the original founders, or excuse me, one of the original funders of Families Against Mandatory Minimums, which is a great organization. And Charles, despite how he's portrayed in the media sometimes, is not a hardcore Republican. He calls himself a classical liberal. And he believes in a free and open society, and he cannot wrap his head around the fact that in this country we've got over 2 million people in prison, which is more than any country in the history of civilization in any country in the world today. Nor can he wrap his head around the fact that people go to prison in this country for long periods of time for next to nothing, for using drugs, possessing drugs, selling drugs in a consensual transaction. Not to say that we're in favor of drug dealers, but the things that we've decided as a society to make criminal and the way we use our criminal code is an abomination. It's immoral. We have I'm going to quote Brian Stevenson as well. He's a hero of mine. We have a 2-tier society, a 2-tier system. Our system now treats the rich and guilty better than the poor and innocent. We all know this. Judges like Kaczynski and Rakoff have been very concerned about people pleading guilty to things they didn't do, yet it still happens. We had 2 really good bills pending in Congress last year that couldn't make it out because of a few people that didn't want to see it happen in an election year. It's very, very disturbing. But there's hope. There's hope because the states are really driving these issues. And again, I'm lucky to work at a place like Koch Industries where Charles Koch feels passionate about these issues, about removing barriers to opportunity for everyone, particularly the least advantaged. And so if you care about giving people a chance in life, if you care about second chances, if you care about redemption, and you want to help people who need help, criminal justice reform work is the place to be. And it's been a great pleasure and honor of mine to work with the NACDL, where Rick is the president-elect, Norman Reamer is the executive director, and with people like Malika. They inspire me and they give me hope because we see our national politics in such disarray, with such rancor, no one can agree on anything. This is something everybody agrees on, and it's happening at the state level more and more and will continue to happen. And because of people like you in this room and people like Malika and Rick and others, it's going to happen at the federal level as well. So thanks for listening and look forward to talking some more.
Thank you, both. I want to pick up on a couple of threads of the things that you said, and then I want to sort of get to my agenda. Certainly, as the moderator, I get to call the tune to a certain degree, and so I'm anxious to dive into a couple of issues fairly deeply. But going back to a couple of things that you said, Mark, and also Malika. One is the idea that criminal justice reform is an avenue for gaining opportunity for folks, for increasing opportunities, and that to the extent that we're involved in criminal justice reform, we are similarly engaged in broadening opportunities and making society more fair. What would you say to the skeptics who say that really the reason companies like Coke, companies like Google are interested in being involved and on the front lines of criminal justice reform is that it really is an opportunity to sort of push back on law enforcement, push back on regulation, and that it really, at the end of the day, inures to the benefit of the bottom lines of your companies, as opposed to sort of more the ideal you just expressed of sort of justice for all.
Well, let me first talk about the genesis of this work so that there is full transparency. When a number of the police killings happened over the past couple of years, there was a real desire on the part of Googlers that there be a response to that we grapple with the issue of racial justice. And as a result of that leadership on the part of Googlers as well as our leadership, there was a real investment in supporting racial justice and criminal justice reform organizations. So we are at the point of having put over 20 million in the last 3 years towards supporting racial justice as well as criminal justice organizations, including a fellowship for one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement. When I came on board, because of my background, I had the experience of teaching in the areas of where now there's a Google campus. I taught kids from East Palo Alto when East Palo Alto was the murder capital of the world. And when I would challenge a lot of my students on why they were selling, they would respond to me that it was their only economic opportunity that was visible to them. So for me to come back to this area, the same areas, neighborhoods where I taught, and to see now a tech community, a Facebook, a Google, a LinkedIn, and to remember what my kids told me, that they didn't see economic opportunities then, before all of this played out. For me, I could only do the work at Google by starting at that place of where my kids were who felt they had no opportunity, and recognize that here was an opportunity for young folk from East Palo Alto and other marginalized communities around and in Silicon Valley to be able to work, right? To have access to our campuses. But as long as we banned the box, that access would be mitigated or fully denied. So the first thing I did when I came on board, which was not motivated by anything else, any other ulterior motive, was to do the work of convincing Google why we should ban the box. And 3 months later, we did, and we made a formal announcement that Google bans the box for its employees. So that is, for me, where the work has come from, and I have been given full support and opportunity to move this commitment through the different platforms of Google. So one of the best things we've done in the last year is that we have YouTube, right? And we did digital love letters from children of the incarcerated to their mothers for Mother's Day, to their fathers for Father's Day. We put it up on the Google homepage. We did a Google post about it. And we did it with YouTube creators. So it was another example of being given the opportunity to use our platforms to think about how do we create this proximity, and how do we do it through these new technologies and the reach that we have as a company.
Well, the reality is criminal justice reform done right benefits everybody in society, including law enforcement. What we're doing now in our system puts it all, the systems that have not yet been reformed at least, puts us all at risk. The only reasons to have a criminal justice system are to protect the public, enhance public safety, and then the other part of it is give people who have fallen astray, who have made mistakes, a shot at a second chance, a shot at redemption, meaning people who are in prison come out better than they went in, and when they come out, they get jobs and won't reoffend. It's the only reason you have a criminal justice system. What we're doing now is not making people safer, it's making us all less safe. It's an abuse of really the criminal justice system. We've decided to use our criminal justice system to treat a public health crisis like crack addiction, for example, as a criminal issue. We've learned from that because we treated the opioid epidemic like a public health issue. Now, some cynics might say that had something to do with the demographics involved. I'm not going to be a cynic. I'm going to say I'm glad we learned something from the last 30 years. When we criminalize poverty, when we criminalize drug addiction, when we criminalize mental health issues and mental illness. We've asked law enforcement to do way more than they should have to do to deal with all these social ills that we have not confronted ourselves. 10 times more people with mental illnesses are in prisons, in jails, than they are in mental institutions, because we haven't funded that. We have law enforcement in schools now, public schools, literally the pipeline between school and prison. We've had them acting as truant officers. We have them deal with all the things we don't want to have to deal with in society. We use them as revenue generators. We have all these ticky-tack laws that people feel picked on. It leads to strife in these communities. So what we're doing, what we have been doing until we started to reform the system, put all of us at more risk, cost us more money, and was, in my opinion, immoral and totally contrary to the Constitution in a lot of ways. So the whole idea is this will make us all safer. And in the communities and in the states that have enacted reforms and done it the best, they've seen that. They've reduced incarceration rates. They've reduced crime rates. They've allowed and provided, kept people out of prison. People who were in prison weren't in for as long a time period. When they came out, they were able to get jobs because of other programming, and it's made it a better society. That's why we want to do it. The United States, we have all these lofty ideals, and the Bill of Rights, 40% of it deals with criminal justice issues. Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments, there was a warning to all of us that that was going to be the greatest threat to liberty. And we've ignored that. We violate those Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth, and Eighth Amendments, in my opinion, regularly, especially the Sixth Amendment, which I know we'll talk about. So our goal is that this will make us all safer and all better. And whether it benefits Koch Industries and private business, that would be great. Because the reality is right now what we're doing isn't benefiting many people at all. It's a two-tier system. And to Malika's point, ban the box, we did that officially a couple of years ago. And in my opinion, it was a great decision. As I said, we hired people with criminal records before that. You've got 1 in 3 people in this country with a criminal record, and that's more than the number of people that have college degrees in this country. And so you as an employer are going to exclude 1 in 3 of your workforce, a potential applicant pool. That's very short-sighted. So that's why we do it. It's a win-win-win proposition for everybody.
And I just want to add to that because I think what's also meaningful here is that if the tech community, and Google in particular, talks about innovation, right, and that in order for us to be able to progress, we must always innovate. We can't innovate successfully if we continue to engage in mass incarceration, right? So leadership has talked about who is the next Bill Gates, right, or the next Sergey Brin, right, or the next Susan Wojcicki, who is, instead of out there learning how to code, instead is locked up without access to that education and that opportunity. And as long as we engage in this kind of systematic criminalization of Black and brown communities, we deny opportunities for innovation. Our innovation will always be stymied as long as we support mass incarceration.
So I'm not a journalist, but my journalist juices are kicking in because I think I see, and maybe I'll be proven wrong, a schism in at least the thought around some of the genesis for this stuff and the bipartisanship of it. And so, Mark, a lot of what you have said sounds in economics. And a lot of it sounds in classist and classism and that kind of thing. And you spoke specifically about not wanting to be a cynic with respect to the demographics. And Malika, you've been a little more straightforward. Initially, you talked about East Palo Alto and opportunity, but in your last comment, you talked about Black and brown communities. And what I really want to get at, and what frequently in these kinds of discussions is sort of the elephant in the room that gets danced around, is race. And you know, in our criminal justice system, from stop and frisk to arrest and pretrial decisions to charge decisions and sentencing to prison, a lot of what happens in the criminal justice system falls most heavily, most severely and arguably disproportionately on black and brown folks. And so my question, and I'll start with you, Mark, is our criminal justice system racist?
Glad I got all the softball ones, thanks. I don't want to declare intent. My point of view is whether it's intentional or not, it's real. There's, as you laid out some of the statistics, I used to know them by heart, but basically the white and black and brown people use illegal drugs at different proportions. Whites actually use them more, but they're black and browns are, I guess, charged and incarcerated at a rate 10 times what white people are. So to me, whether it's intentional or not, maybe isn't that big a deal. We got a problem on our hands. And, I think that what I saw when I started in the prison, there were a number of poor white kids there, and there were a lot of poor African Americans and poor Hispanic people there as well. It's a demographic issue as far as poverty. But I am not going to sit here and say that race isn't a factor here. That it is. I mean, it disproportionately affects minorities. And, that's something that we need to come to grips with and deal with. Now, I'm not going to blame any one person or situation. I think, again, these laws were passed in the 80s and 90s in a bipartisan way, and it's changed over time. But we do need to be honest with each other and with ourselves that whatever the intention was, when we decided to lock up people for using illegal drugs, selling illegal drugs, or what have you, it was going to most likely impact people who were black and brown, given the situation, given the demographics. And I think that that's another reason why we need to fix this system. We've got a justice system now that a lot of people in our society have lost trust in. And that tears at the fabric of our free society. That's what we've seen in places like Ferguson and in Baltimore recently. Ferguson obviously there was the Michael Brown shooting, but there was also the fact that in a town of 10,000, there were 30,000 municipal fines levied against the citizens of that town. They feel picked on. And it's something we need to deal with, and white people, black people, brown people need to come together on it. And it's not productive when a white guy like myself says, no, race isn't involved. It is involved. We need to fix it. And that's why part of the reason why we favor the reforms we're talking about.
So I'm going to come back to you on that, but I want to let Malika answer the question. Is our criminal justice system racist?
Yeah, but I think we have to be intersectional here, right? Like, not only is it an issue of racial, but it's also racial and gendered bias, right? So I spent too many years hearing stories from young black and brown girls under the age of 18, who had been bought and sold, who had been subject to commercial serial rape. And when law enforcement came into the picture, they didn't see those girls as victims. Instead, they arrested them, called them child prostitutes. And then those girls were in fact convicted on charges of prostitution, even though they are girls. So our criminal justice system denies our black and brown girls the status of child. And there's also something very disturbing around the connection between sexual violence done to our black and brown girls and their criminalization. So the most egregious example of what I would call the sexual abuse to prison pipeline for girls is how we arrest and convict underage girls for child prostitution. But the other egregious manifestation of this sexual abuse to prison pipeline is that we also arrest our girls for running away, for the status offense of running away. And why do most girls run? Because they're running from abuse. Abuse in their foster care home, abuse in their community. So we tell women to run from abuse. But when our girls run from abuse, they're locked up on the status offense of running away. Right? So the criminalization of girls who have been subject to some form of sexual violence needs to be called out when we talk about mass incarceration or we talk about the racial bias of the criminal justice system. We have to have a gendered lens on that as well. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about how there has been a war against the Black body. But what I would add to that, what I would put next to that critique, is that there's also been this terrible way in which Black and brown girls, their bodies, have been rendered communal property, that has been a norm, right? So when our girls are hurt, when they are subject to commercial serial rape, they're actually not seen as victims because there's this entrenched racial mythology that the Black and brown female body is unrapeable. So they're not hurt because they're prostitutes, because they're unrapeable. And I think it's really important that when we're at this critical moment in talking about criminal justice reform, and we're at this critical moment of being able to surface the issue of racism in criminal justice, that we don't walk away from how this impacts girls of color and women of color, and that we become as critical and as informed in the way that we understand the impact of mass incarceration on Black and brown women and girls with the same commitment to dignity as we have done with our Black and brown men.
So I want you to help me understand. I'm perfectly comfortable linking racism and sexism in our criminal justice system. I have no issue with anything that you just said. But what I want to understand from you, and I think I got an answer from Mark, but I'm going to come back to it, is the racism and the sexism that you've described in our justice system, is it intentional? Is it systemic and structural and intentional, or is it something else? Is it unconscious, implicit bias? Talk to me about that.
I mean, I think it's all those things, right? I mean, it's a machinery.
But the intentionality, is it in your mind to some degree intentional and structural?
Absolutely. I mean, when a police officer takes a 14-year-old Black girl from Compton and who has just been hurt, right? Who has just been purchased, pulls her out of the car of the so-called John and calls her a dirty Black bitch, right? And puts handcuffs on her. And then the judge agrees to keep her behind bars. There is intentionality around that. That is reinforced by popular culture and racial mythologies that are gendered, that don't see that girl first as a child, right? And also does not recognize that she has been harmed, that she is not a Jezebel, that she is not a child prostitute, that in fact she has been hurt in a very serious way. So I think all of it, in these really terrible ways, intentionality, racial mythologies, structural racial and gender bias conspire to really create routine and systematic denial of opportunity and safety for our Black and brown girls.
So, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. I hear you saying that yes, racism and maybe sexism as well. I didn't ask you that specific question. Exist.
I only answer the questions.
Smart, good lawyer. Exist, but that you're not prepared to say that they are systemic, structural, intentional, but more unconscious, maybe implicit, the subject of implicit bias, maybe, or just disparities that flow from economics. But I'm interested to hear your take on it.
Well, here's what I think.
Yeah.
That when we declared a war on drugs, and drugs were the scourge to be eradicated from our communities, law enforcement went to the place where there was open air drug markets. I mean, it's an easy pickup, right? I remember hearing David Simon, who was the creator of The Wire, talking about he covered Baltimore crime before the war on drugs. He's worked for the Baltimore Sun. And before the war on drugs, Baltimore had the highest clearance rate of violent crime, so rape, murder, robberies, all that type of thing, kidnapping. And then the war on drugs happened, and the mandate was jack up kids on the streets of West Baltimore or wherever else, put them up against the wall, find a couple of vials, and there you go. And the police officers, they were told to do that. There was a war on drugs. And they were also learned that, hey, when I jack some kids up on a street corner in Baltimore and get the crack, I get 2 or 3 overtime slips a week. And what happens when I work a violent case, a crime case, a murder case, or something that takes longer, I might get an overtime slip maybe every once or twice a month if I'm lucky. So I think we all respond to incentives. And we declared as a society in a bipartisan way, and as I recall it, unfortunately or fortunately, the Congressional Black Congress was on board with these mandatory minimums. And that's what we decided needed to happen to keep our communities safer. We were completely wrong, and it devastated the African American, the black and brown communities. I will say that. And I say it's the way the system was set up. I don't know that these police officers said, let's target these people. They were doing what they were told to do and going where they thought the drugs were. And as Van Jones has said many times when I've been on panels with him, he went to Yale, and 95% of the campus is nonviolent drug offenders, and no police ever showed up there.
So what are you saying then? Is that is the deployment of those resources a conscious, intentional decision to target particular communities, or is it just a sort of unjaundiced, unbiased look by the police department at where they think they're going to be the most successful in terms of making arrests, and they're going there regardless of who might be in those communities?
Well, I'm not the best person to ask on this. You could answer it better than me. But my sense is they're going into these communities where they were looking for street drugs, in particular crack cocaine. That's why it's such a difference in the treatment of opioids, which are afflicting everybody, but also wealthy, middle-class white people. So was there a race element? I don't know that there was specifically, but that's how it played out. And those were the communities that seemed to have the most ravages by drug crimes, and they were black and brown. But again, was it because of racism? Maybe, but that's what they were told to do. That's the way the laws were set up. Those were the incentives. That's what we allowed to happen. And, what was it? 100 to 1, the disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Like most everything in the war on drugs, not based on data or science or anything else, it was on fear and emotion. It's now 18 to 1. It should be 1 to 1. We still aren't there. We couldn't even get that retroactive for those. So is that race? I don't know. To me, at the end of the day, I don't want to call anyone out as a racist because I want to work with everybody to fix this crap. And I find when you call people racist, it doesn't always go out so well to get them to help you on things. But it doesn't really matter to me. It's a completely unjust system. And it has disproportionately impacted people of color. There is no question.
Well, let me ask you if it matters. Let me ask both of you if it matters in terms of solutions, because one of the things that I want to make sure we get to in this discussion is ideas and solutions, and also how the business community can weigh in and have impact in these discussions and around these issues. Does it matter from a solution standpoint, from a thinking about this strategically? How do we fix this? How do we reform this? Does it matter if your belief is that it's intentional, and so we need to address whatever the underlying problems are that are propping up this systemic, structural, intentional system, versus an idea or thought or a belief that it's not intentional, it's symptomatic of other societal problems, whether it's economics or what have you, but the disparity exists, but it's not intentional. Does that lead you to two different sets of solutions with respect to reform?
Yeah, I think it's a really valid question, and I'm gonna and part of it is also a question for justice-based movements in terms of how they perceive the work that they want to do, and I think it's important to honor those decisions that they make. I want to say from a practical level of doing that reform work, when we were trying to end the draconian practice of shackling mothers during labor and childbirth in federal correctional facilities. When it was first brought to my attention, I thought it was a mother who had been transported from Florida to Tennessee. She was 7 months pregnant and had a belly shackle over her. And I thought it was just some kind of like terrible isolated practice. And then I started to research that in fact it was across the board, and we started to collect testimonies from women who had been incarcerated in federal correctional facilities all over the country, who gave some variation of a story of being shackled while pregnant, and then most terribly during labor and childbirth. And of course, for those of us who have given birth, right, we recognize how absolutely insane it is that anyone would like run in the middle of labor and childbirth. I remember I had in the middle of giving birth to my third child, I had an epidural, which I did not have before. And I remembered, oh my gosh, most of the women behind bars have epidurals, and I couldn't feel my legs, right? So just the absolute insanity, right, that we create this kind of practice and subject women to it. At that point, there were very few Republicans that were standing up on the issue of criminal justice reform. But there was Prison Fellowship Ministries and Pat Nolan, right? And I took Pat Nolan to every single Republican office with me, right? Because he was willing to be a voice on our side. And because of his words and his support, we were able to change that policy. And in places like Texas, where it was routine practice to do this to women at the state level, because till this day, most state prisons are doing this to women. But we had folks from the Right to Life movement and the pro-choice reproductive justice movements joining together around ending this practice, because they might not agree on when life starts or doesn't start, but they could all agree that when a life does come into being, when a life is born, that life should be born with dignity and freedom. And so I think that I respect the need for us to unpackage the ideological differences and to have those conversations and make decisions that folks feel are necessary for the movement. And on a practical level, I think there's also room to recognize that I don't care, right? I don't care what brings you to the table, as long as you're willing to come to the table and change the law.
Did you want to jump in at all, or if not, I'm going to...
What she said.
Got it. So there's never enough time, and it's clear that there are questions in the audience. But before I move on and start to take audience questions, while I have these two here, there's one other sort of hot button issue in the criminal justice community that I think, unlike race, which is sort of the elephant in the room that never really gets discussed and people dance around, I think of more as sort of the invisible man. Folks don't really even recognize it as an issue or the real connections that it has to some of the problems that we've been discussing, and that's public defense. conservatively, 80% of all accused in this country are represented either by a public defender or assigned counsel. And we know both on the ground and anecdotally stories of overworked public defenders, under-resourced public defenders, poorly trained public defenders, underpaid public defenders. And so my question to you is, and I'll ask it all, I won't unpack it, I'll ask it all at once because we're running out of time. Is there a crisis in public defense? If there is a crisis in public defense, does it have a direct impact? Are we suffering from overcriminalization, mass incarceration, the rise of collateral consequences, in part because of the lack of zealous advocacy? And what's the role of Coke, Google, the business community in fixing the problem, the crisis, if it exists? And Mark, it looks like you want to start.
Yeah, I know the answer. I'll do this one. No. Yeah, no, it's an absolute crisis. You know, the Sixth Amendment obviously says what it says, that if anyone accused of a crime by the government it has some fancy language, but basically says that you have the right to counsel. And then Gideon versus Wainwright said if you can't afford counsel, one must be appointed to you free of charge. And you talk about, particularly someone, I don't know what I am politically, but I definitely believe in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and everybody always talks about the rule of law. We violate that every single day. And it's a constitutional crisis, in my opinion. You've got the government with all its awesome power, and I think public defenders, defense lawyers in general, but public defenders, court-appointed public defenders, whatever it is, are heroes. They are standing. The only thing that stands between the government taking away your life, liberty, property in pursuit of happiness, that's it, a lawyer. And our founders, again, they got a lot wrong maybe, but they nailed this one too, because all these other rights in the Fourth, the Fifth, the Sixth, the Eighth Amendment, whatever they are, they don't matter if you don't have a lawyer to help unlock them. And if you don't have a lawyer, you're probably going to get railroaded. That's the problem in our system. That's part of the two-tiered system. So it's a constitutional crisis because the government that's trying to take away your liberty has a responsibility, a constitutional responsibility. It's a natural right for you to have a lawyer to be defending you when you're charged with a crime. And they're not honoring that. In fact, they're not even funding it, and they're prosecuting you. So I don't understand how that can happen in our society. I really don't. And I know there's been some litigation about it. To me, it's as big a deal as anything else we talk about. And my sense is, to your point though, Rick, our whole system is so out of whack. You've got 4,500 to 6,000 federal criminal laws. We don't know how many. And when Congress was asked the Department of Justice to tell them how many precisely there are, the Department of Justice said there's too many, we can't count them, we don't know. You've got that problem. You've got the fact that in the war on drugs, we decided we didn't trust judges anymore. We have much more faith in prosecutors to make these decisions. That's led to a completely flawed system, whereas you know better than me that the prosecutor is the prosecutor, the judge, the jury, and the executioner. And then you end up, oh, by the way, let's rig the system totally. The people who need the lawyers the most aren't getting them. They're not getting, not that these lawyers aren't committed, some aren't very good maybe, whatever. They don't have time, they don't have resources, public defenders by and large, and they're overwhelmed. And so someone is signing away their constitutional rights, ruining their lives with very little consultation, very little understanding of what they're doing. And you get these draconian sentences because we've decided that we don't care what the circumstances of your facts of your crime were or what happened to your victim. We're just going to look at a grid. You sold this much, it weighed this much, you get this much time. And then we put you in prison. After the '94 crime bill, bipartisan again, of course, we took away all the programming, education, everything else. So you sit in a cell and you become a better criminal. And then when you come out, 50,000 collateral consequences to keep you from getting a job, getting housing, getting loans, getting licenses. Sometimes you can't even be with your family. So the whole thing's insane from beginning to end. And that gets back to me, while there's a big race issue, it's a poverty issue, and it's a lack of people caring enough about what's really going on to get proximate to it, as you started the discussion tonight. But the Sixth Amendment issues are huge. People need to be talking about it more. There's a lawsuit that was filed by the ACLU against the Missouri Public Defenders Program a couple of weeks ago. Hopefully it makes some changes, but the reality is there's no money for anything anymore. Where I'm from in Kansas, I'm from Massachusetts, but where I live is in Kansas, we can't fund schools anymore, so no one's going to be likely to be able to fund criminal defense lawyers. So that's why we need to shrink the whole size of the prison industrial complex, who we put in prison and for how long, and how we let people come back, and hopefully we'll let them come back as full citizens again, because we have a system now where they pay their debt to society, i.e. they go to prison. We accept that payment, we make them serve their full sentence, but we never forgive the debt. And they have the scarlet letter F on their head forever for felon. We need to end that. So that's what I think.
And before we turn it over to Malika, what is the role of corporate America in the solution?
Well, so for Coke, we've funded NACDL programs along with the Sixth Amendment Center in scholarships for new public defenders and court-appointed lawyers, so they learn about trying criminal cases, what criminal process from experts like Rick and Norman Reamer and thousands of others. And we've also funded a couple of studies, one that's looking at the South Carolina system and the Indiana system, hoping that the approach was involving everybody who's a stakeholder, from the prosecutors to the judges to defense lawyers, victims, all these other things, to make sure that the system's working better. We hope that happens. I think personally that at some point, to me, it doesn't make sense for all the reasons I've talked about, that the government that's trying to take away your life, liberty, and property is the one. They still have an obligation to get you a lawyer, but we need to do something to get it out of DOJ, to get it out of the prosecutor's office, because there's an inherent conflict, and they're just not going to do it, and public opinion won't rise to that level. It's kind of like, you know, the whole thing on pardons and clemency probably shouldn't have been decided by a bunch of prosecutors who put the people in prison to begin with. So I think that hopefully business could help drive some public-private partnerships that would be able to fund these programs, and philanthropic activities could help that as well, philanthropists. Those are some thoughts I have, because we already have it. It's the law. It's in the Bill of Rights. It's your natural right. It's a God-given right. It's a fundamental liberty, and we've got the fact that the Supreme Court said 50-something years ago it's the law of the land, and we don't do it. So I don't know what else to do from a law perspective. We're going to have to try something else, like Action Citizens doing something.
Malika, what's the role of Google and other major players in corporate America to help with the problem we have, the crisis really in public defense?
Yeah. I mean, and I think this is a question that we really have to ask ourselves right now, given the Sessions-led DOJ and the budget cuts that have been announced. I think that first, the role is not to be detached, right? The role is not to see this as an issue of others and not us. The role has to be that of intersectionality and interconnectedness. Part of what I know lends to the crisis is this issue of no supports, right? And so I think that the tech community, which is the new concentration of wealth and power, really has to think hard about what is our financial commitment in these spaces where there's such a dearth of services and support. I know for Google, we have invested some funding in looking at prosecutorial reform, but certainly this part of the conversation is as urgent and needed. And I think that these conversations have to happen in the tech community, and the tech community has to be held accountable, right? That because there is so much wealth that is part of tech, that we have to have a role of responsibility in ensuring that these basic legal protections are in fact supported.
Wow, I've got a whole new series of questions in my mind, but I know that we are over on time, and so I'd like to see if there are questions in the audience, and let's start on this side. Okay, how about this woman in the back right here to the far wall? Can you get to her?
Thank you for coming to my school. I'd like to thank you guys for donating your time, first off. I have two questions, but I guess I'll narrow it down to one because we're over on time. As you guys probably know, we are facing another heroin epidemic. A lot of our citizens are addicted to painkillers, and this is the next cheapest alternative. Do you guys think that this new crisis is a good opportunity for us to sort of reevaluate how we deal with these crimes? In what ways do you think we should go forward in helping these people?
Well, I'm going to let them answer, but let me just say, just to tailor your question a little bit, I wouldn't call heroin addiction a crime.
No, that would be my point, that it should be treated like a public health issue. People who are drug addicts should get medical help, treatment, make them better. Don't treat them like a criminal. And when you treat people like a criminal, they'll act like a criminal. So we should treat it like a public health issue. If nothing else, hopefully we've learned that from the war on drugs.
I just want to add to that really quickly. I spent so many years with mothers who were behind bars, not because they were criminals, but because they were untreated addicts. And they were addicted to crack cocaine for the most part. And I witnessed the ways that they suffered because they were separated from their children, right? The first thing that they would do when you would meet them is show pictures of their kids. And I remember the first few times I started going to women's prisons, it felt like I was sitting Shiva. My I sat shiva with my Jewish mother's family, and that's what it felt like, right? And I tried to understand why that was, like, why are there these deep circles of grief? And it was because all of these women were mothers to children, to young children, and they had been separated from them because of untreated addiction. And what is also important to name in this, not only is this about a public health issue that should not be criminalized, but this is also about sexual violence. Because when you talk to the women who are suffering then with crack cocaine addiction, 5 years ago around meth, or the women now who are suffering around heroin and opioid addiction, always the underlying narrative is so frequently tied to sexual abuse, and sexual abuse that happened when they were young that continued. And the only way that they could deal with that abuse and the trauma was to be able to numb themselves, to self-medicate. And I think that often gets lost when we talk about addiction, that we lose the particular gendered ways that women have suffered from sexual violence, that it has not been recognized, and that instead women are in these positions of numbing themselves out because of unaddressed injury and trauma.
Let's go to this side of the room. Gentleman right here in the second row.
Thank you for being here. You talked about many, many issues, but one of them that I think that the last one, that the question that you brought up about corporate America, I think one of the issues that should be attacked is educating those that are in prison so that when they come out, they don't go back in. And that's an issue. You talked about 20, 30 different issues, but I think that's one that has to be assumed too.
Yeah, no, I totally agree that the key to keeping someone out of prison is typically that they have someone in their life that is a positive influence that supports them one way or another, that they don't want to disappoint. But education is absolutely key. Jobs, opportunities, absolutely key. And if people don't get that and they end up in prison, they need it even more while in prison, the education factor, and when they get out. And that's why, the 94 crime bill had many issues that were terrible about it, in my opinion. The one that stripped away all the Pell Grants and the education grants, that was a problem. What we're seeing, though, more and more are that, it's taken a while, 20 years or so, but there are more programs in prison. There's some public-private partnerships. There's some programs like Project Jumpstart in Baltimore, Maryland, which takes guys coming out of prison in Baltimore who can't get jobs usually. There's a need for skilled labor. They put them through an apprenticeship program. It's got like a 10% recidivism rate. We need skills training, we need jobs training, we need education training, we need spiritual training, and it needs to happen in prison once people are in, because they need to come out better than they went in. That's the only reason you have a prison.
I just want to add, and I think that there's a real opportunity around coding. The challenge that we face is being able, in many prisons, to bring computers in, right? And this is something really basic just with juvenile justice, right? So we have all these kids who are behind bars, and they can't even get ready to take the GED because the GED is computerized now. And so they can't access how to prepare for the GED or how to take it because it's all on computers now, and they don't have access to computers when they're behind bars.
And the last thing I just want to add, as I slowly morph into a panelist and not a moderator, is that when we get to the place where we have right-sized our criminal justice system and it is dealing with those issues that it ought to be dealing with, then I completely agree with Mark. But what I want you also, to understand is that there are people in this country every day who plead guilty to things that they did not do. There are people in this country every day who are in prison who are not criminals, who have done nothing wrong other than be poor or black or unable to afford the kind of counsel that they need to unearth the fact that they really are not guilty. So I want to just be clear that we're clear that everybody who's in jail or in prison tonight is not there because they did something wrong. We have time for two more. I'm going to exercise the moderator privilege and go to one of my colleagues in the back right there with the beautiful orange tie.
Hello. I actually am a public defender with the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. One of the issues that I've seen lately, at least since I've been there, is that there's an inextricable tie between the prosecution and the law enforcement, where sometimes through lack of transparency that they oftentimes are overzealous in prosecuting clients of mine to put them behind bars based on history where the officers have had, or just external pressure from the prosecutors themselves to get conviction rates or to win a trial. That also leads to an issue where I think, Mr. Holden, you touched on that, where there's a lack of transparency where police officers who commit questionable law enforcement tactics, such as the one that happened in South Florida this weekend, where the DA declined to prosecute the man who was literally tortured in a shower. What could we do, and also what could you two do as well to kind of break that lack of transparency that I think would be very instrumental in actually helping criminal justice reform?
I think we have to use data more around what's playing out in prosecutorial and law enforcement practices, right? So that we can see the patterns, and we're already starting to do this around the conduct of law enforcement and being able to connect that to data to make the right assessments and interpretations. And I think we need to really push for more of that so that we can understand the way this machinery works and be able to disrupt it. And it's one thing to be able to tell that story as a public defender. It's another to be able to demonstrate that story through data.
Real quick. I think that part of it needs to be open file discovery. Well, Judge Kaczynski, who I think a lot of recommended that, and he's like the most brilliant guy I'm aware of. So, I mean, I think that my point of view is, and I've said this to people in prosecutors and others, and they say, well, what if we have information on a higher value target or blah, blah, blah? And I say, I don't care. I'm the one who you're trying to put away. I think there needs to be open file discovery. I think there need to be reforms. I don't know what they do here, but the filming, recording of all interviews with anybody who's a suspect all the way through, they need to be filmed. I think that any data about the people in the background of law enforcement and their history needs to be relevant. I think there needs to be grand jury reform. I think they have it in New York, where the accused is allowed to present evidence without waiving their Fifth Amendment right. I think that the prosecutors in grand juries shouldn't be allowed to use evidence they know will be inadmissible at trial. I think that they have to use more exculpatory information in the grand jury to actually show that people are innocent, and that gets back to the open file discovery, so you don't have these Brady issues that happen every day. They happened when my company was prosecuted. There was grand jury doctored evidence, and they happened to U.S. Senator Ted Stevens famously, and they happened to people who are defended by heroes like you every day. And so things like that to make it an even playing field the way it should be, instead of just trying to put people in prison, because that isn't the goal of a criminal justice system. It's supposed to be justice.
Let me just say, since I'm wearing two hats here today, that Omar, who I'm very proud of, is not only a young lawyer in my office, but he came to us as an NACDL summer fellow. So I'll put a plug in there as well. Last question on this side. All right, woman in the red, please.
Thank you so much. This is such a fabulous program. I'm a Hunter undergraduate, and I went to Rikers Island back around 1968 when one of my professors was the principal of the school on Rikers Island. I have a question about Rikers Island. Today in the Post, Governor Cuomo was talking about the injustice of Rikers Island and why can't it be closed. Here we have a mayor who's married to an African-American woman. Why is he not doing something, and a lot of things, to control the abuse, the torture, all the terrible things that are happening in Rikers Island, which is right across the way from Queens Boulevard and is right on the other side of the river, and people come out of there and they're on Queens Boulevard taking the bus? Why is the mayor allowed to get away with this do-nothing about Rikers Island, which is a terrible place, where there are a lot of children who should not be in prison?
Well, I'm going to get out of the way and let Malik answer this one.
So a couple of things. .org supports Glenn Martin and the work that he's doing around just leadership to call the mayor to shutter Rikers. And we are right now in pre-production doing a short doc on Rikers to be able to really render how the story of Kalief Browder was not an exception, but the story of Kalief Browder is representative of what so many adults and children are subject to when they go through Rikers. That they are usually innocent, right? Because we know 80% of those who go through Rikers are not charged with guilt when they enter into Rikers. Being able to, I think that I'm grateful that we know Kalief Browder's name, and I'm grateful that we know his story. But I am worried that he is seen as an exception, as the most egregious iteration of what happens at Rikers. I think it's really important to tell the stories of so many other adults and children who were subject also to human rights violations when they were there. Right. And so I think our hope is to use a platform that has more scope to be able to tell the story.
I've got to stop you. I'm sorry. Did you have one last thought? Did you want to on that, Mark, on this question?
I'm not touching this one.
All
Thank
right.
you.
I wanted to save just a couple of minutes to give our incredible panelists an opportunity to give us the benefit of their closing thoughts. And so we'll do that, and we'll start with Malika.
I wasn't ready for this.
So we'll start with Mark.
Yeah, start with Mark. I started.
She'll do better than me anyway, so I might as well get mine over with. I've kind of said everything I need to say, I think, but I think that I was talking earlier with students, a number of students from Hunter College, and they're so passionate about it, and that's going to be the key, because politics is downstream from culture. And, I grew up, like I said, in the 80s and saw some of this, and I didn't really do anything. I thought it was a terrible system. I got involved later. But young people today are much more passionate about it, and you see what's going on in all the states. There are reforms coming. It's going to be more and more and more, because it's good stuff, and it's really, when politicians will always migrate to the things that are successful. And when you see crime rates go down, incarceration rates go down, you see that the spending goes down on putting people in prison, and then you can spend that on schools or mental health. That's all good stuff. But, your question about Rikers Island, I have no clue why it's still open. I don't understand either. But I don't live here. I mean, there must be a reason, and you all must be comfortable with it because it's still open. And if you weren't comfortable with it, you would show them the heat, and then they'll see the light. And all these things only change when you make it a big issue. And it just can't be people who are seen as directly affected by it. It has to be all of us, because we're all in this together. And that's why there's so many issues in our country that are such a mess these days, that are unsolvable, that people don't even want to try to solve them. You call healthcare, whatever else it is. This is one, for some reason, that has brought people together on the left and the right. And we need to seize on that and all these things you're talking about, because we have gotten comfortable over the last 30 or 40 years deciding that anyone who's in prison is bad and is a criminal. And like we talked about today, that's not the truth. There's some bad people in prison? Yeah. The majority aren't. Some don't belong there. Some have other issues. Some had lousy lawyers. Some had lousy parents. Some just had bad luck. But they're all coming back, so we all need to grow up and think about that. That goes back to what Brian Stevenson says, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And so if we could just have more of a society, and I know speaking in New York City and Manhattan, everybody's pretty much aligned here, but I do this in Wichita, Kansas a lot, and they're aligned as well. It's trying to be more forgiving towards people and their neighbors on these particular issues and keep driving on it. Politicians are going to go along with it, other than ones who are just complete troglodytes, and hopefully they'll get washed out.
Malika.
So this whole notion of how culture always eats policy I remember years ago when Senator Santorum was in office and would spew so much homophobia. I was in his office to talk to him about welfare reform. And there were these kids who were from Pennsylvania, not from Philly or Pittsburgh, but from Eastern Pennsylvania, who were there to talk to him. And he comes out to address them and asks, does anybody have a question? And the kids start asking him, why do you have such a problem with gay marriage? And why are you so uncomfortable with gay people? And he was taken aback, right? Like he didn't expect questions like that from these kids from that part of Pennsylvania. And he gave these ridiculous answers, and he could tell the kids weren't buying it. And he got more flustered. And at that moment, I realized that we would have marriage equality, right? Because the culture had already shifted, right? And it was just a matter of time before the politicians caught up. And we saw that play out. This was in 2001, right? And then we saw how there was a state-by-state movement to push for marriage equality. And I think there are a lot of parallels that we have around this push for ending mass incarceration, that we are seeing a cultural shift, that artists and social media and thought leaders have helped to create. And it is a powerful moment that will also have the corollary of these state-by-state efforts to have criminal justice reform in more significant ways than we see happening at the federal level. But here's my concern. I have great hope and faith and belief in the moment that we are in and what we will be able to achieve. But I am so deeply, deeply dismayed at how we are leaving out women and girls. And this is not an issue of the politicians who are making that mistake. It's us. It's the criminal justice advocates. It's the foundations. It's everyday folk who are too comfortable only having this conversation in terms of race and not being courageous and thoughtful and demanding enough to say that we have to talk about this issue at the very dangerous intersection of race and gender. And if we don't do that, we're going to leave too many women and girls behind in these places of unjust criminalization, and they deserve far better.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Malika. Thank you, Hunter College. Thank all of you. Keep up the fight. The only thing that I can say that's good about having a wireless mic or having this handheld mic as opposed to it being wireless is now I get to drop the mic.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you, Rick, for moderating the conversation, and thank you, Mark, thank you, Malika, and I hope you'll all come upstairs. But thanks, Rick.